Good morning. Hope you guys are doing well today. We are going to talk about Rehoboam this morning. My guess is we're going to start getting into some names that you don't recognize and certainly can't pronounce. It seems like that when we study, we look a lot at Saul and David and Solomon, and then we kind of let it go from there. Today I'm going to share with you the story about how the kingdom of Israel got divided into North Israel and South Judah. Rehoboam is the first king of South Judah, and that is Solomon's son. Jeroboam will be the first king of North Israel. We'll look at him next week. And between the last week and the next 2 weeks, you're going to kind of see how the whole thing fits together. Okay? I need to remind you of a couple of things. The first one is 1 Samuel chapter 8. The first week we started talking about the kings. The first lesson was we want a king. And if you'll remember, the nation of Israel approached God and said, we want to be like all the nations around us, and all the other nations around us have kings, and so we want a king. And God said, well, I thought I was your king. And they said, well, that's not good enough. We want a flesh and blood man to sit on the throne. And God told them then, he said, let me tell you what will happen. Your king will tax you to death. He will tax you, and you will be abused by his taxation, and he will treat you like slaves. He'll put such a burden on you that you will wish that you had never had a king. And they said, doesn't matter, it's not that big a deal, we just want a king. And so God told Samuel, you know what? Give them what they want. They want a king, they can have a king. And when they take a king, they get to suffer the consequences. And but we will hear about this again. Okay, so just remember that as we get into the lesson today, because that's going to play a role into what happens with Solomon, Rehoboam, and Jeroboam. Okay? Second thing I want to remind you of is how we ended last week, and that is in chapter 11, when Solomon had left the Lord. He had left the Lord. He went after other gods because of his 1,000 wives and concubines. And so God confronts Solomon and tells him that he is going to take the kingdom away from him. And we finished last week in verse 36 of chapter 11, his son will have one tribe, so that the descendants of David my servant will continue to reign in Jerusalem, the city I have chosen to be the place for my name. And so he's saying, listen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take Solomon, the throne, away from you, and I'm going to give it to someone else. And I'm going to allow you to keep one part of the nation of Israel, and that's the tribe of Judah, but everything else I'm taking away from you. And I'm doing it, if you'll remember last week, he said, I'm doing it for your son, because of your father David, and because of Jerusalem. So part of the reason that God allowed Solomon and ultimately Rehoboam to keep one of the tribes of Israel, the nation of Judah, is because he loved David, and he made that promise to David that would stay in his lineage. But through the lineage of David came what? Jesus Christ. And so Judah was stayed with Solomon and his descendants because it was through that bloodline that Jesus Christ was born. Okay? So one more thing, so we make sure we understand what's going on here. There's 12 tribes of Israel, correct? Named after the 12 sons of Jacob. Those 12 tribes, there were only 11 that occupied land, because one of the tribes was Levi, which were the Levites or the priests, and they didn't own land, right? So there were only 11 tribes that owned land. So there's 12 tribes of Israel, but the whole time we're talking about the division, it is the division of the 10 northern tribes of North Israel and then the one southern tribe of Judah. So one southern tribe, 10, and you go, well, that's only 11. That's because the Levites never owned land. So that's where the 12 comes from. Okay? So are we all clear as mud on all of that? Okay? We're going to pick up the story now here in chapter 12. So God calls Jeroboam. Jeroboam was just a hard-working guy that Solomon noticed was doing a really good job working for him. And one day, God comes to Jeroboam and says, listen, because of Solomon's sin, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from him, and I'm going to give the 10 northern tribes to you, Jeroboam, because of what Solomon has done. So, Solomon is still king at the time. Solomon finds out that God has called Jeroboam to be the king, so Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam. Jeroboam escapes to, of all places, guess where he escapes to? Egypt. Remember what we talked about last week? What's the first thing Solomon did when he was king? He makes an alliance against the will of God with Egypt that represents bondage and the old life. And so where does Jeroboam go? And you're talking about a slap in the face to Solomon. He goes and seeks solace. He goes and seeks time away, protection from Solomon with who? The king of Egypt, the very first guy that Solomon had an alliance with. And so Egypt comes back and slaps Solomon in the face and protects the guy that's going to end up taking the throne. Okay? So now, finally Solomon dies, and Rehoboam takes the throne. And so right now, when we're going to start reading here in chapter 12, Rehoboam is king. Jeroboam is in Egypt. He's coming back home. Solomon has just died, and Rehoboam, of course, has no idea that the kingdom is going to be taken away from him. Okay? So let's start reading in 12:1. Rehoboam went to Shechem, where all Israel had gathered to make him king. When Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of Solomon's death, he returned from Egypt, for he had fled to Egypt to escape from King Solomon. The leaders of Israel sent for Jeroboam, and the whole assembly of Israel went to speak with Rehoboam. This is what they said: "Your father was a hard master. Lighten the harsh labor demands and heavy taxes that your father imposed on us, then we will be your loyal subjects." Okay, so we are how many kings in? Saul, David, Solomon. We're 3 kings in, and everything that God had told them back in 1 Samuel 8 was coming true. Harsh labor demands, high taxes, and the people are saying, we can't live under this. We can't live under this. Rehoboam, you've got to stop this. You've got to reverse this. And if you will, we're yours. We're your loyal subject. We'll stay with you forever. You can be our king. Here's Rehoboam's chance now to basically solidify the nation and really be a hero for the people by lifting this heavy labor off of them. Rehoboam replied, "Give me 3 days to think it over, then come back for my answer." So the people went away. Now, where we're going to spend most of our time is in the next 4 or 5 verses, because in this is some really, really good lessons on leadership. Okay? So King Rehoboam went to discuss the matter with the older men who had counseled his father Solomon. "What is your advice?" he asked. "How should I answer these people?" The older counselors replied, "If you are willing to serve the people today and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your loyal subjects." But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders and instead asked the opinion of the young men who had grown up with him and who were now his advisors. "What is your advice?" he asked them. "How should I answer these people who want me to lighten the burden imposed by my father?" The young men replied, "This is what you should tell those complainers. My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. If you think he has been hard on you, just wait and see what I'll be like. Yes, my father was harsh on you, but I'll be even harsher. My father used whips on you, but I'll use scorpions." Okay, so Rehoboam gets 2 pieces of advice. Pieces of advice from some older men that were advisors to his father, and some pieces of advice from his peers that were younger men that were raised with him. Okay? This is Rehoboam's moment that's going to dictate his future, the kingdom, Israel, everything is right here in this conversation. Because the people of Israel are saying, "We want to follow you, Rehoboam. You're Solomon's son. We respect you. We're ready to follow you, but we need you to do a couple of things. You got to back off. You got to back off on the taxes. You got to back off on the harsh labor. And his older counselors, the counselors of his father, give him some great advice. And this is where we're going to stop and talk for a few minutes this morning. They said, if you are willing to serve the people today and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your loyal subjects. So here's leadership principle number one we're going to talk about this morning around our tables. Good leaders serve their followers. Good leaders serve their followers. Top down, you do it because I said to do it leadership doesn't work very well. If you want to lead people, you serve people. Do we have any examples of that? Oh, yes, Jesus. The perfect leader. And how did he do? He said, I have not come to be served, but to serve. And here's what I have found in churches, I've found it in businesses, I've found it in government, although you don't see it in government very often, is when people will lead through serving the people they're leading, you know what people automatically want to do? Follow. They want to follow. They only follow when they feel like their leader is self-serving. So if you're in a leadership position, which I know you are, because you have a family, so you're leadership at home, so what's the key? Serve them. If you're a leadership position at work, whether you're the owner or a manager, if you have anyone under you at work, what's the best way to lead them? Serve them. You're at church, serve. You will raise up to leadership, right? That's just a leadership principle. And here's what's so interesting. Over the years, the last 40 years in business, there's been book after book after book after book that's come out that's secular, that when you read it, it's this principle. And when you read the books, it's talking about all the principles of servant leadership that Jesus taught us in the Gospels. There really is nothing new under the sun. The best secular principles come right out of the Bible. Principle number one, serve the people you lead. So we're going to stop right here. We're going to go around, we're going to talk about this principle for a few minutes, and then we're going to come back. There's three principles we're going to cover this morning. This is the first one. Then we'll come back and look at the second leadership principle. Good leaders serve people. I want to tell you a story of my son. Can I brag on my son? Is that okay? Fathers can do that, can't they? Chris is 30 years old, lives up in New Jersey. He's now become a chaplain in a hospital up there. And so it seems to be a little bit different up there than it is down here. A lot of the funerals are arranged through the hospitals. He does a lot of funerals, a lot of prayer for dying people, obviously, but he also does a lot with the doctors and the nurses and sits on the ethics committee at the hospital and helps make those kind of decisions. And so he's kind of got his fingers into a whole lot of things. But he has made a habit since he started is anytime he'll see a nurse or a doctor, he will just simply ask the question, how can I help you today? He said, that's just the only question I ask to the doctors and the nurses in this hospital. How can I help you today? And he said it's given him unbelievable favor with them because all the chaplains before him, they just go in and pray with the patients but don't really interact with the doctors and the nurses. And so he says, what I've ended up doing is now all of a sudden the doctors and the nurses are coming to me and are wanting prayer and are wanting to talk. And he said, I don't know what that's going to do kingdom of God-wise over time, but he has great favor. Why? Because he's serving the people, right? He's taking the time to say, what can I do for you? If you could add one thing to your repertoire in your job and at your home, it is that phrase, what can I do for you? What would your wife do if you walked in the house tonight, you got home from work, and you just said, sweetheart, what can I do for you? Yeah. Oh my God, what's wrong? That's exactly right. What is going on? What got into you, right? Can you imagine if you came in tonight and did that with your children, right? So really, really important. So number two principle is that good leaders have discernment. Good leaders have discernment. Now, it's interesting to me here, Rehoboam seeks advice from older men. He seeks advice from younger men. He gets some good advice and some bad advice, and literally the advice he chooses dictates his entire future. And he chose the bad advice. He rejected the older men. He accepted the counsel of the younger men, and he didn't have the discernment to be able to lead the people. Good leaders have discernment. And here's reality is anytime you're in a position of influence and you're talking to other people, you're going to get advice. Good leaders can tell the difference between good advice and bad advice, right? So, Leonard and Tony, they run this organization. They're great leaders. And I guarantee you that these guys have had good advice given to them and they've had bad advice given to them. And the reason they're here today and this place is successful is they had the discernment to not follow the bad advice and to follow the good advice. Because every leader gets bad advice that will sabotage them, right? Is that true? Absolutely. But good leaders can tell bad advice. And let me just say this, and I don't want to hurt any of you young guys' feelings. But I think in our culture, but I will. One of the things Satan has done as our culture is we don't value age as a culture the way cultures historically have. And the result of that is we're not getting some great wisdom that can help us along the way, because in our culture, a 30-year-old has more to say than a 70-year-old. And that's a tragedy, because with age comes wisdom. And with youth, sometimes is not the experience, and youth make a whole lot of mistakes. And I'm 56 years old, and I've learned that if a 25-year-old gives me advice and a 70-year-old gives me advice, yes, they both can give good or bad advice. But age does play a role in how much I'm going to give to that advice, how much I'm going to take that into advisement. Because I remember 25, I had a lot of answers, I just didn't have a lot of experience. and my sermons weren't very good back then. But with age comes wisdom, right? And so there is an age factor with that. And like I said, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, for you guys that are 20 and 25 and 30 years old. But there is something to wisdom that comes with age. And so one thing I would encourage you to do is really work on discernment. Work on discernment. When you hear advice, don't just take it, but analyze it. Take it back to the Word. Take it back to prayer. Take it back to those people in your life that you know that have your best interests at heart, and make sure that's good advice before you take that advice. Because I'm telling you, right now in our culture, there is a plethora of awful advice that people are willing to give you if you're willing to listen. Correct? So let's talk about discernment and discerning good advice from bad advice, specifically that age thing, okay? Several questions are going to come up on your screen if you're watching by video. Talk about that, and we'll come back and talk about the third leadership principle we learned out of this text. Third lesson that we learn out of the story of Rehoboam about leadership is this: good leaders learn from past mistakes. Good leaders learn from past mistakes. Some of the best lessons you learn in life are watching the mistakes of others and learning from them, or learning from your own past mistakes. Rehoboam got this gift handed to him when he became king. The people rose up and said, Rehoboam, we're going to tell you how to lead us. Your father was too harsh on us. He was too hard on us. He taxed us too hard. We want to follow you. But your father made some mistakes that you have to correct. And if you will correct them, we're in 100%. Rehoboam gets good advice. Rehoboam gets bad advice. So now look what happens beginning in verse 12 of chapter 12. 3 days later, Jeroboam. Okay, so Jeroboam has now returned from Egypt, and he's back there. He's a part of the crowd that's going to listen to his answer. All the people returned to hear Rehoboam's decision, just as the king had requested. But Rehoboam spoke harshly to them, for he rejected the advice of the older counselors and followed the counsel of his young advisors. He told the people, my father was harsh on you, but I will be even harsher. My father used whips on you, but I'll use scorpions. So the king paid no attention to the people's demands. This turn of events was the will of the Lord, for it fulfilled the Lord's message to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, through the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh. So, guess what? Why did Rehoboam lose the kingdom? Because he didn't learn from the mistakes of his father. And the people came to him and said, we're ready to follow you, but you need to make these changes. He seeks good advice, he seeks bad advice, he takes the bad advice, it cost him the kingdom. Good leaders learn from past mistakes. And here's the thing, not only past mistakes of your own, but really wise leaders learn from the mistakes of others. Learn from the mistakes of others. So let's stop just for a few minutes. Let's talk about this one, and then I'll wrap up the story of Rehoboam, and then we'll jump into Jeroboam next week. There's going to be a few questions up on the screen for those of you watching by video. So I want to wrap up the story of Rehoboam. I want to read to you out of chapter 12, and then I want to show you what the Bible records about the actual reign of Rehoboam, what happened during his reign. But beginning in verse 16, when all Israel realized that the king had rejected their request, they shouted, "Down with David and his dynasty. We have no share in Jesse's son. Let's go home, Israel. Look out for your own house, O David." So the people of Israel returned home, but Rehoboam continued to rule over the Israelites who lived in the towns of Judah. So the northern Israelites said, oh, you've rejected our request, forget it, we're going to go home. You're not our king anymore. We reject you as king. So King Rehoboam, beginning in verse 18, sends Adoniram, that's close enough, who was in charge of a labor force to restore order, but all Israel stoned him to death. Okay, so he sends the head of his labor force to restore order, and they just stone him. When this news reached King Rehoboam, he quickly jumped into his chariot and fled to Jerusalem. Now, boy, there is a coward if you've ever seen one, right? He says, uh-oh, these guys are serious. And so he goes and hides in Jerusalem. The northern tribes of Israel have refused to be ruled by a descendant of David to this day. So in other words, this writer that's writing many years later is saying to this day, Israel, the northern tribes of Israel, will not be led by someone from Judah. When the people of Israel learned of Jeroboam's return from Egypt, they called an assembly and made him king over all Israel. So now only the tribe of Judah remains loyal to the family of David. So that is how the kingdom was divided. Rehoboam had the chance. He didn't take the advice. He made a bad decision. Northern Israel rebelled. Jeroboam had come back, and so they say, you know what, you're going to be our king, and only the one tribe of Judah, basically Jerusalem and the provinces right around Jerusalem, Rehoboam kept, the family of David kept. Everyone else in Israel separated, made a different nation, a different king, and unfortunately Judah and Israel fought each other a lot. It was almost like a civil war that happened for many, many years, okay? So that's what the Bible records about Rehoboam and how the nation divided, okay? So the rest of chapter 12 and 13 are about Jeroboam and his leadership. And so finally, down here in chapter 14, verse 21, the writer will talk about Jeroboam. We'll talk about that next week. He comes back to Rehoboam, and this is all that's recorded about Rehoboam's reign as king. And I think he reigned for 17 years. Yeah, he reigned for 17 years. Listen to this. This is all the Bible has to say about 17 years of reigning as the king of Judah and Jerusalem. Are you ready? Beginning in verse 22, during Rehoboam's reign, the people of Judah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, arousing his anger with their sin, for it was even worse than that of their ancestors. Who's he talking about? Solomon. They built pagan shrines and set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were even shrine prostitutes throughout the land. The people imitated the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land ahead of the Israelites. Okay? So he continued on with what Solomon had taught him, but he added in the cult prostitutes. In other words, their religion ended up looking exactly like the religion of the pagan lands around them. They became so secular that you couldn't tell the difference between God's people and the secular people. Okay? That should be a warning for us, by the way. So, verse 25, here's the one story about his reign. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam's reign, King Shishak of Egypt came up and attacked Jerusalem. Okay, let's talk about Solomon. Remember all this from last week? First thing Solomon did as king was made an alliance with Egypt, which represented bondage and the past. Does it come back to bite him? Oh, yes, it does. It is that king that houses Jeroboam and offers him asylum so he does not have to get killed by Solomon. After Solomon dies, 5 years into Rehoboam's reign, the king of Egypt that Solomon had made the alliance with comes back and attacks Rehoboam. And listen to what it says here. This is very interesting. He ransacked the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and stole everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. Now remember, Solomon had all this wealth. He was so wealthy that he made the shields for his army out of gold. Now that's ridiculously wealthy, right? But he's got this alliance with Egypt. And he's bringing all these people in to see all of his splendor. So what does the king of Egypt know? Where all the stuff is stored and how much stuff there is. So he waits for Solomon to die, and then he comes back in and destroys the temple and steals all the things of value. Don't miss the lesson. You shake hands with the past. When you go back into bondage and you shake hands with bondage, what happens every time? It will end up coming into your temple and wiping you clean. Correct? You got that spiritual implication there? We see it happen all the time. Men come to Christ, but they don't let go of the past, and the past ends up absolutely destroying them. Exactly what happened to Rehoboam. And so this is the saddest part to me. After Rehoboam made bronze shields as substitutes, he entrusted them to the care of the palace guard officers. That's all it said about Rehoboam's reign. 17 years. And what do you have to say for yourself, Rehoboam? Well, I got all the valuables stolen out of the temple, and that's about all I've got. So you know what I had to do because I didn't have any gold? I had to replace them with bronze shields. Here's what I want you to get. God, everything God has for us is authentic. It's the real thing. Satan is the master imitator. He mimics everything that God does. What happens is when we give up the authentic, we're left with the mimic. And what happens in leadership is when you have failed leadership, you end up settling for the imitation. And I see it happen with people over and over and over again. God gives us real joy. That's authentic, comes from within. But Satan offers us external happiness if we'll pursue things around us. And people will not find joy, but will run after happiness. And I can take every one of the fruit of the Spirit, I can give you everything authentic from God, and we can talk about how Satan will mimic it, but it never provides what God provides. And yet I watch people compromise the authentic for the mimic all the time. Let's talk about leadership just for a minute, and then I'll turn it back over to the tables one more time. I watch it happen in churches, and I watch it happen in businesses. Failed leadership, people that aren't good leaders, instead of going to God to find out what He authentically has for them, they just copy what other people have done. And I'm not talking about, reinventing the wheel every time you're going to make a decision. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about taking the time to find out, what does God have for this business? What makes Equity Auto different from every other store in town? What does God have uniquely for us? And then you discern that and you follow that, and God gives the increase, right? He gives the blessing. But what happens if these two guys, they decide not to be leaders anymore, and they just mimic what's going on across the street? Well, what's old Cactus Jack's doing over there? Let's go find out whatever he's doing. Let's just do what he's doing. You think they'd walk under the blessing of the Lord? No. Because when failed leadership settles for the imitation, settles for the mimic, you lose the blessing of the Lord. And it's true in family, and it's true in business, and it's true in church, and it's true in your spiritual life. We're not called to just mimic what someone else does. We're called to be leaders and to find out what God has for us. And we never let Satan steal the authentic with a cheap imitation. This is a really, really deep concept, and it's a very, very important concept for your spiritual life. So we're gonna stop here today. I think you've still got 6 or 7 minutes left. I want you to talk about this and talk about takeaways for the group this morning. Okay? Rehoboam is a sad story of a man that in one decision lost the kingdom and really lost his ability to lead his people. Okay? We don't want to be that man. We want to learn from his mistakes so we can be great leaders. Okay? Around the tables, and then the day is yours.